let's go to objection number 2. Okay. Daniel Dennett and many others, this is a common kind of atheist objection on the internet. It's not really an objection, though. It's just a question. And if you remember back from what we learned earlier, a question is not an objection. It's kind of like when we earlier talked about, well, why would God allow this evil? Well, that's a good question, but it's not really an objection yet. It's just a question. And similarly, who caused God? That's a good question, but it's not really an objection. So what is Rhoda going to say? Rhoda's answer to the question, who caused God, is going to be nothing. Nothing caused God. That's about it. Okay. Now, he's going to say a little bit more than that. Okay, so why think that nothing caused God? Well, first, really, though, we're talking about the necessary being that Rhoda has taken himself to argue for. Okay, and this being, okay, well, the point about this necessary being is it doesn't really need an explanation for why it exists, just because what it is for it to something to be necessary is that it couldn't not exist. So we originally thought contingent beings needed a causal explanation because a contingent being can either exist or not exist. Okay, exist or not exist. And then we wonder, well, why did it exist rather than not exist? Okay, that's why we think contingent beings need a causal explanation. But for necessary beings, they couldn't not exist. So there's really no question, why did it exist rather than not exist? Because, well, it couldn't have not existed in the first place. So that's why Rhoda will want to say, the unnecessary being is just uncaused. It doesn't need an explanation because we don't need an explanation for why it exists rather than not exists. Okay, and he gives a nice little example. So there's necessary beings. There's also impossible beings, like square circles. We don't really have to say, well, why aren't there any square circles? Okay, we don't say, well, because nobody made one. We don't say that. Okay, we have to say, well, and the reason why a square circle doesn't exist is it couldn't exist. There's no question. It's not like it could have existed, so why does it not exist? It's more just it couldn't exist. Okay, so there's that. There's always more to say, but that's kind of the main gist of page 96. Of course, as usual, I recommend you read to get more in depth from what Rhoda from what Rhoda says. Okay, last, what does the cosmological argument show? Okay. Well, Rhoda wants to say, first of all, it shows that there's at least one necessary being. He's not going to be arguing yet that exactly what that necessary being is. He's not arguing yet that the necessary being loves us, like Schellenberg talks about, or that the necessary being wants a relationship with us or a perfect relationship with us. Okay, that's not yet part of what Rhoda is trying to show. Now, Rhoda does think we have some reason to think that the necessary being is that there's just going to be one. Okay, it's just a small reason, and the reason is this. What he's appealing to is what philosophers of science call the principle of simplicity. Okay, so when you're trying to think of an explanation for some things, okay, this is kind of like some of you might have heard of Occam's razor, okay, which is you don't look for the more complicated explanation. You don't look for an explanation that appeals to more things. When we first thought about the idea that maybe the way we discovered Neptune, I believe, is they saw that there was something that was causing a gravitational effect in a certain place in space. And so what they posited was the existence of a planet to explain this gravitational effect. And that's how they discovered Neptune. I might be mixing this up. It might have been Uranus, but either Uranus or Neptune. But the point is that when you try to think of an explanation for something, you think of the simplest one. Okay, so using the principle of simplicity, sometimes called Occam's razor, you look for the simpler explanation. And so in this case, one necessary being can do it. Don't try to say many necessary beings is the explanation. Okay, so there's that. Okay, and then Rhoda makes a suggestion, which is, well, why would the necessary being, how would the necessary being bring about the contingent beings? And for that, on page 97, he says, here's something that would make sense. A being with, if the necessary being is intelligent and has free will, then it can freely choose intelligently to bring about these contingent beings. So that would explain why there's something rather than nothing, or why there are contingent beings rather than those contingent beings not existing. Okay, and the reason is because an intelligent being chose this. Okay, and that's what the necessary being did. Now we're getting a little bit closer to what traditionally people think of as God. Not only a necessary being, but a one being that's also intelligent and has free will. Now at this point, Rhoda only spends about a paragraph on that point, so he's not leaning too heavily on this. Really, what Schellenberg's gonna, or sorry, not Schellenberg, Rhoda is gonna be, he's gonna be arguing for the intelligence of the necessary being in the next chapter, and that's what we'll be talking about next. Okay, last point on the handout is, one, it's just for you to consider. Has Rhoda convincingly argued for the necessary being? And to look at that, try to see if he might disagree with any of these premises. Do you agree with the principle that every contingent being needs a causal explanation? Number two, do you think all the contingent beings require a causal explanation? That's premise A. And then premise B, well, if that's the case, do you agree that it must be a necessary being? And if you got that, that seems like you should believe in a necessary being. Now, at this point, you might be tempted to be like, sure, maybe there is a necessary being. And no, I add at the end for the handout, there's Schellenberg's ultimism. Okay, so an ultimist might be like, sure, there is a necessary being that's the causal explanation for why all the contingent beings exist. Okay, but we don't have theism yet because we don't have the personal ultimism. Okay, that's what Rhoda's going to try to get us in the next chapter. So, okay, so that's all. That's finishing up the rest of chapter 5. Think of some questions you might have based on what I just said, and we'll take a little bit of time on Tuesday to talk about those things. So, all right, so that's the end of part 1 of Thursday's lecture. Okay, bye.